So traditionally, 3D art for games has been created manually. Artists have been using specialized 3D modeling software to create everything from scratch. These programs allow you to model, sculpt, and paint props and environments that you can then import into a game engine such as Unity. But creating realistic-looking models and textures is actually a really complicated process, and it requires a combination of artistic skills and technical know-how that is pretty hard to get. Plus, making something that looks real is just incredibly time-consuming, because turns out real life is pretty detailed, and adding all this detail by hand, that's a challenge. So over the last few years, a new trend has been taking over the game dev industry. I'm of course talking about 3D scanning. This is a process where you go out into the real world with some specialized camera equipment and record geometry and material data that you can then take back into your virtual world. And at the forefront of this technology has been a company called Quixel. They've built a huge library of assets and materials by going out and painstakingly making thousands of scans around the world. But so far this process has been pretty complicated and it requires a lot of special equipment, so not much luck if you want to do it yourself. But recently, Ubiquity6 reached out to us about a service they've been working on called display.land and how they're trying to make the power of 3D scanning available to everyone. Now, display.land is a free app that you download and it allows you to create 3D scans just using the built-in camera of your phone. So just to be completely transparent, this video is sponsored by display.land, but I will say that we were completely blown away with how well this technology actually works, and even crazier just how easy it is to use. So for the first scan, we tried creating a scan of our office. Andreas walked around the room while filming everything he saw. Then, once he felt like he'd captured everything in a good amount of detail, we hit upload and the scan went to the cloud for processing. And after a little while, it was ready to view on the phone. In fact, display.land is a social app as well, and from here it allows you to share scans as well as follow other creators. But for this test, we just sent it to the computer and opened it up in a browser. And getting it into Unity was just as easy. We simply exported it as an OBJ and dragged it in. I created a material, assigned a texture, and there it was. Of course, the scan itself does have the lighting of our office built into the texture, but I found that even with that, it reacted pretty well to the lighting conditions of our scene. So I added a few point lights to where there were lights in the office, as well as dragged in a few example assets. And it's pretty amazing how well they fit the scene out of the box. They instantly looked like they were part of the room. And this is when I realized, if the scan has actual geometry, and it actually looks pretty clean, we can probably have physics objects interact with it. And sure enough, after adding a mesh collider and a sphere with a rigid body, we had physics. In fact, I got so excited I created a quick script that would spawn spheres over time, which ended up looking pretty cool. It definitely answered the question of how our office would look if it got flooded by red balls. In a weird way, it's kind of beautiful. So with this first test under the belt, we were ready to do some more scanning. But how does this process actually work? Well, display.land essentially creates 3D captures using a process called photogrammetry. It uses many images of the same geometry, but taken from different perspectives to create a 3D reconstruction of the scene. It's the same reason why animals have two eyes. You need two different perspectives in order to determine depth, which is also why if you close one eye, it gets pretty hard to tell how far away things are. So after taking a video with some different perspectives on the thing you want to scan, the video, as well as some sensor data, gets sent to the cloud where it gets turned into a 3D model. Some scans take just a few minutes to process, while larger scans can take up to a few hours. And we actually slowly started to figure out what makes a good scan. In fact, it's something you really get better at with practice. Generally, you want to shoot in fairly even lighting conditions and move the camera at a slow and steady pace. It's also a good idea to scan from as many different angles as possible and to avoid any reflective surfaces. And scanning objects with lots of texture definitely helps the tracker a lot. For example, take a look at these props. We scanned these outside on a fairly cloudy day, and all of them have a good, textured, but non-reflective surface. Of course, sometimes the sun peeked through the clouds, but the tracker actually managed to handle that quite well. In fact, we thought they looked so realistic that we might be able to use them together with regular 3D models. In other words, could we take these scans and put them into an otherwise virtual environment without them standing out? So to answer that question, I went to the Unity Asset Store and found this free industrial environment. I imported everything into Unity, played around with the lighting and materials a bit, and added a first-person controller. And voila, we had a tiny game where we could move around and interact with the environment. So far so good, now for the scans. And this was actually just as easy. I downloaded each scan and opened it up in Blender to cut off any unnecessary geometry. I then re-exported, dragged the model and texture into Unity, and assigned a simple lit material. And right away, it looked amazing. I'd expected the scans to stand out like a sore thumb, but as soon as Unity did its rendering magic, the concrete table blended in perfectly. Of course, the scans aren't optimized to use as simple geometry as possible. There's inevitably going to be a lot of extra vertices on these models, so if you're looking to use them in a commercial game, I would recommend doing some work in order to try and reduce the amount of polygons. But the cool thing is that you can utilize the fact that you have a very detailed version of the model by simply baking all of this detail into a normal map. So next up, I tried importing these statues, and they were even more impressive. In fact, you could actually read some of the writing on them, so I created a tiny gallery for the player to explore. Finally, I thought the tree stump was just too good a scan not to include, but I didn't really have anywhere to put it in the level since it didn't have any greenery. So I turned the player into a tree, which ended up looking more disturbing than expected. But of course, the real test was still to come. Could we make a game with a level that was entirely 3D scanned? So we went out into our courtyard to see if we could scan a larger environment. And while we had good success on the buildings, it wasn't really a fair fight for the scanner considering the amount of clutter and bicycles reflecting light everywhere. Plus, it was raining that day, which of course makes everything shiny. And while just scanning some buildings is cool, we thought, wouldn't it be even cooler if we took some commonplace items lying around the office and put them together to make a level in real life that we could then load up into Unity and play on. So that's exactly what we did. We immediately got started setting up a nice playing surface and placing objects that our player could walk on. And after a quick scan of the table, we hopped back on the computer. I cut off some geometry, loaded it into Unity, created a ground cube for it to stand on, and the level was ready. Of course, we still had to build the actual game. Our idea was to create a top-down shooter where the player has to fight through a series of enemies. So I set up a quick prototype scene and immediately got to work on creating the basic mechanics. I started with movement and making the player aim towards the mouse. I then made him shoot, added some enemies to shoot at, as well as some particles for bullets and explosions. And at this point, I was ready to put everything inside of our level. So I imported the player, added a rotating camera, and placed around a few enemies. And baking the nav mesh for this was extremely easy. I just played around with the slope and step height a bit, and the enemies were moving appropriately around the level. Of course, they currently did nothing to damage the player, so I made them shoot and stop when they got close enough. I also implemented spawning in case the player died, and made the enemies spawn randomly throughout the level at a slowly increasing rate. Finally, I made some boundaries around the level so that the player wouldn't fall off, and with that, we had a game. It's nothing fancy, but it actually plays pretty well considering how quickly we put it together, and everyone at the office had a blast playing it. So in conclusion, while we can never get the highly optimized AAA quality scans that you can with specialized equipment, display.land actually makes it possible to start bringing the real world into your game. Personally, I just had a blast playing around with this technology. If you want to check out display.land for yourself and make some cool looking scans, it's completely free and available on the App Store as well as Google Play. We'll have links to both in the description. And that's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone who participated in the Brackeys Game Jam. It was a blast to see so many people joining the event, and we'll of course have a video showcasing some of the games out soon. On that, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks to all of the awesome Patreon supporters who donated in February, and a special thanks to Faisal Marify, Lost to Violence Love Forever, Leo Lisette, Nobby Ninja, Daniel Desanik, Dante Sam, Jacob Sanford, Marc-Antoine Girard, Naoki Iwasaki, Gregory Pierce, Michael Korobov, The Mighty Zeus, Owen Cooper, Elson the Fierce, Yijit Kair, and Erasmus. You guys rock.